You ever get the urge to just weld two things together? Maybe you've got some scrap metal lying around and you think, hey, I can make something strong and awesome out of this. And sometimes you absolutely can. But other times, you get disastrous results. Sparks fly, the metal bubbles, maybe it even cracks. That, my friends, is often the result of trying to weld two dissimilar metals together. It's not as simple as just melting them together. There's actual science at play. The properties of metals, their melting points, their chemical compositions, all of this comes into play when you're dealing with heat and pressure. Over the next few minutes, we're going to dive into why certain metals just don't like each other and why you shouldn't force them. Let's kick things off with two of the most common metals out there, aluminum and steel. They seem pretty basic, right? But try to weld them together and you're in for a bad time. See, aluminum melts at a much lower temperature than steel, around 1,220 degrees Fahrenheit compared to steel's whopping 2,500 degrees. So by the time you get that steel hot enough to melt and fuse, your aluminum is going to be a puddle of goo, probably even vaporized. You're not going to get a clean weld, and you're definitely not going to get a strong joint. It's like trying to glue a piece of paper to a brick wall with chewing gum. The materials just aren't compatible. Now let's talk about copper and carbon steel. Copper, as you know, is a softer, more malleable metal. Carbon steel, on the other hand, is much harder and more brittle. You can already see where this is going, right? When you try to weld these two together, the difference in hardness becomes a major problem. The intense heat of welding causes the carbon steel to expand and contract rapidly. Copper, being softer, can't keep up with these changes. And what happens? Cracks, my friends. Cracks. The weld becomes weak and prone to failure. It's like trying to sew a button onto a leather jacket with a flimsy needle. The materials just don't have the same give. Now, let's move on to cast iron and stainless steel. These two metals might seem similar at first glance, but trust me, they're not meant to be welded together. Cast iron, with its high carbon content, is brittle and prone to cracking. Stainless steel, on the other hand, is known for its corrosion resistance and strength. So what happens when you apply heat? The differences in their chemical compositions create a whole mess of problems. The chromium and nickel in stainless steel react with the carbon in cast iron, forming brittle compounds that weaken the weld. It's like trying to mix oil and water. They just don't want to play nice together. Magnesium and titanium are two metals known for their lightweight and strength, making them popular in aerospace applications. However, welding them together is a recipe for disaster. Magnesium has a significantly lower melting point than titanium. When you try to weld these metals, the magnesium melts and vaporizes before the titanium even gets close to its melting point. This creates a porous, weak weld that's prone to cracking. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to hold. Brass, an alloy of copper and zinc, and pure zinc are two metals that don't mix well in the welding world. When you try to weld brass and zinc, the zinc tends to vaporize and burn off due to its lower boiling point. This creates a porous weld with poor strength and a high likelihood of cracking. It's like trying to build a sandcastle with dry sand. It just won't hold its shape. Finally, let's talk about lead and aluminum, two metals that should never ever be welded together. Lead has a very low melting point and is a very soft metal. Aluminum, while having a lower melting point than steel, still requires significant heat. When you try to weld lead and aluminum, the lead melts and flows away from the heat before the aluminum can even get close to its melting point. You end up with a mess of molten lead and a very unhappy piece of aluminum. It's like trying to mix oil and water. They just won't combine. So there you have it, folks. The science behind why you can't just weld any two pieces of metal together. It's not about brute force. It's about understanding the properties of the materials you're working with. Just like you wouldn't use a hammer to drive a screw, you shouldn't try to weld dissimilar metals without knowing the potential consequences. Remember, a little knowledge goes a long way in the world of metalworking. So next time you're feeling the urge to weld something, take a moment to consider the metals involved. You might just save yourself a lot of trouble and maybe even a few fingers.